Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Village News Week in Review. I'm your host, Adrian Shropshire, and joined by my good friend and our co-host, Anoa Changapek. We are here every Friday or Saturday to break down the news of the week, remind people of what happened and things that they should be paying attention to. And today we actually have a very special guest. So I think, Anoa, I want to just sort of do some highlights quickly of this week. I mean, I think if we didn't think that we were in the very heart of the midterm election season yet, like if we didn't think we were there yet, this week certainly reminded us that it is hot out in these streets, that there are shenanigans afoot. And the perfect example, two perfect examples of that are the fact that the President of the United States has once again asked the Supreme Court to let him mess around with mail-in voting, right? To let him limit who can get mail votes, all of the things, right? To try and make sure that he can determine the outcome of this year's election. So that was one. And then the other was him, sort of flippantly and nonchalantly saying, well, if I don't get my way at the Supreme Court or wherever, I'll just declare a national emergency. And I will presumably then cancel the election. Whatever it is that he is suggesting that he has been doing, right? This isn't new that he said that. It is also not new that his flunkies have said the same thing. But this is the kind of, we know we're in an intense moment because they're starting to say and do desperate things.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are like 81 days out from the election. There's so much happening. I mean, we're literally days away from people being able to even start requesting their mail-in ballots, right? So we're very quickly leaving the primary season and getting into, like you said, the full key to the midterms. And to have the sitting president, I mean, once upon a time, people would call the president of the United States the leader of the free world, right? Like having the so-called leader of the free world actively engaging in sabotaging an election that's in progress and before the final votes have even been cast it would be a wild and interesting show to watch if this was not our real lives, right? And I know we've said stuff like this before, but like I think part of it is though, like the it's not just bearing the witness, but like really like this is not the time to tune out. I know we hear it all over the news, the different things he's doing, but like really leaning in and getting clear because it's not just that it's not right. It is wild. We're literally watching like a robbery in progress. Yeah. And there's still time to stop it.
Yeah. And there's 100% chance that they are going to do all the things that they say that they're going to do. So
absolutely.
People shouldn't just be watching and thinking like, oh, there he goes talking crazy again, right? He is 100% going to try and do everything that you hear him say. And particularly when you start to hear his minions echo that and talk about ways that they can do it, like try and justify legal arguments for how they can do it.
Right.
That's how you know they are absolutely going to try and do that thing. But we talked last week, Noah, about the fact that we are in we talk about November, but we are still in primary season.
Yeah.
We saw the big primaries in Michigan and Missouri and other places a week or so ago.
Tennessee.
In Tennessee. And this week we had some other big primary elections in Minnesota, where we saw both the primary vote for the U.S. Senate and also for governor. Peggy Flanagan, who was the one of the Democrats vying for the nomination there, won big, which I'm not sure that people expected that she was going to win by as much as she won by, and she did. And one of the things that I don't know that people are totally tracking is that if there are two Native women running for U.S. Senate, one in Minnesota, Peggy Flanagan, one in Alaska. Do what you can. Yeah.
I know the founding fathers are kind of standing on their heads right now at the prospects.
So that was one. We also saw a big race in Wisconsin. That was, I think, again, there was this sort of setup like DSA versus, the centrist, although it really wasn't
that
isn't
helpful.
At all.
And it's not helpful. It doesn't
it's not
tell
helpful.
anyone anything. Yeah.
It's not helpful. It's also untrue. right? It's untrue to look at candidates, and in this case, a black candidate, and say, well, that person is centrist because they're not a DSA member. It's just nonsense. But we saw this big race. There was an assumption that the DSA candidate was going to win based on polling. She did not win. Right, the other candidate who sort of was one of many folks vying for the nomination for
Governor yeah.
David Crowley. He came out on top. So we've had these big races with outcomes that people weren't expecting, and some of it is because the polling in these races are making people believe things that simply are not true. And so it is, again, causing people to say, well, should we even be believing any poll that ever comes out? And so I wanted to take a minute in our episode today to actually talk about polling. And we have happen to have one of the nation's foremost political posters who is joining us, and that is Cornell Belcher from Brilliant Corners Research and Strategy. So let's talk to Cornell. Well, thank you, Cornell, for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk with you, especially not just, but especially during the height of campaign season, which I guess we're in. Given the number of primaries that have just transpired and a couple coming up. So I want to talk to you about black voters. Obviously, when we talk, we're always talking about polling related to black voters. I did want to talk to you, though, for a second, just about polling, period. So over the last, couple of weeks, as we saw both the Michigan primary and the Wisconsin primary, there was lots of expectation, right, about the outcome of these elections. In Michigan, I think El Sayed was polling at double digits, I think, over his opponent. In Wisconsin, it looked like the progressive DSA candidate was also going to be, her polling was showing that she was going to win. And neither of those outcomes really happened. So in Michigan, we had a very close race, and in Wisconsin, we also had a very close race. And so I know that people have been complaining about polling since whenever the last many elections.
Since the start of polling, actually.
Since the start of polling. But what is going on? Because these seem really off, right? These numbers seem really off. And then people are saying things like, trust no polling is good, which I don't believe. I believe that your polling is good. I believe that the polling that you help us do at Black Pack is good. But what is going on with what we're seeing in these wide margins that don't come to be?
Well, there's a couple things, and I've been talking about this for a while, and I've actually put out some tweets about it as well. There's a couple things. One, I'm going to start with this. People want polls to tell them the future.
Yeah.
It's not the job of a poll to tell you the future. People want polls to predict the future. Polling cannot predict the future. There are way too many variables at play for polling to predict the future, so stop trying to look at polling to tell you who's going to win or who's going to lose a race. Because it's not about predicting the future. That's one. Two is there's far too much polling that's happening now by outside groups and in public. Like you go back 10, 15, 2 decades ago, you rarely saw any or heard anything about a poll, where every now and then a newspaper would come out with a poll. Now today there is a constant deluge of so-called polls. And what you have is you actually have a lot of groups out there now that are using polls to drive narrative.
Yeah.
And
clearly, yes.
Yes. So you got and look, the public polling that's been out there had a lot of the public polling that's been out there has been completely crap, and I'm going to talk about why it's crap momentarily. Right. But internal polls for a lot of the campaigns where you have professional pollsters who are following the rules and ethics of polling and a random sampling, they've not been off.
Right.
And then there's primary polls, and primaries are tough to poll because they're a narrow, very very narrow segment of the electorate. And so you saw these polls and these primary polls in Wisconsin and Michigan seem to be way off, and they're even more difficult to poll than a general market. Because look, you've got, look, you're lucky to have 60% of eligible voters voting in a general election, and take that down to like you looking at sometimes 15-20% of voters voting in these primaries. So it's a much more narrow
Yeah.
group, which makes it polling even more difficult. Now that said, the polling I had in the primary in Georgia was spot on for Keisha. We never thought for one moment that that we weren't going to win. We weren't going to win that race. But what you have, Adrian, is a lot of these polls that are so-called polls that are cutting corners, and they're doing it on the quick and they're doing it cheap. Polling is incredibly difficult, and you can't do it on the cheap.
Yeah.
You have people doing
And
these.
don't I know it? Don't I know it?
You got the invoices from me to prove it. But you have them doing these online samples that are not really representative of a random sample of the actual universe.
Right.
And some of these online samples are so skewed. Look, after 2016, the Democratic Party and the DS&D Trip did a study of it, and some of it showed that some of these online samples are so skewed that you can't even weight them. You know, weighting is a process we use in polls. You can't even weight them in line with how the actual universe is. However, you can do them very quickly and do them very cheaply.
Yeah.
And that's what you see a lot of corner sort of people cutting corners. That's one, and two is there are people driving narratives, trying to drive narratives with poor polling, and the media is allowing them to do it.
Yeah. This is the problem. I mean, I think there's both the driving the narrative and you're trying to tell a story, and you find a set of voters who will tell that story for you, right? That feels like one. But the other is just the, trying to understand and be clear. And this is why it's hard for just regular folks, right, to understand, like, what should they pay attention to? Like, how do they understand what the electorate is and isn't saying in any given moment when there is this flood of polls? Like, and once, because I think to your point, you used to know, when a poll came, because it was only a handful of people that were doing them.
Yeah.
And so you could say, oh, there's the Gallup or there's whatever, right?
Yeah.
But now there's, particularly in election cycles, there'll be like a long list of all kinds of people who have done polls, and it's got to be, it's hard for people, it's hard for us, right, to know, like, well, which ones of these things should you even be paying attention to?
No, that's right. But again, I'm going to lean into this, Adrian, is how it's gotten wrong, and we in the media have to do a better job of this, because we'll put out a poll number, like, and again, I remember from a couple of years back, there was a poll, Biden and Trump. It was a Florida poll, and it said Biden leads Trump in Florida. Now, for the regular voter who's reading that newspaper, Biden leads Trump in Florida. Oh, Biden's going to win Florida.
Right.
But that's not what that means. And I think the race was like 47-45 or something like that. So you still have a big swath of voters still hanging out there. And we got to explain, if we're going to be using polls to drive these stories, we have to actually explain what's happening. So the next day when voters look at the paper and say, oh, well, Trump won Florida, that means the polls were wrong, right? No.
Right.
That's not at all what that means, because there's so many variables that are still happening. And unless you get 50+1, anything can happen. And one of the things that you look for in polling is who are those voters who are still sticking out there? Even if it's 47-45 and your candidate is up, that means nothing, because what it means, unless you get 50+1, who are the voters who are still hanging out there, and which direction are they most likely to break? I had plenty of polls where my candidate was ahead, but then I look at underneath the surface, and the voters are still hanging out there. They're not our voters. So at some point you're at a ceiling. But we will put out these fundraising memos that say, invest in this campaign because look, we're ahead in this state. And the truth of the matter is, you're ahead because the other candidate has not consolidated the undecided, and the undecided is theirs to consolidate.
Which feels like sort of what happened in Wisconsin, right? Where it was
is
clear that Crowley had consolidated the rest of the Democratic electorate in the primary
when Barnes
until he did.
Yeah, well, a lot of the polling was taken also when Barnes was still in the race.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, and I think that's also a big story of that, is that a lot of that was so when Barnes left the race, that vote had to go somewhere.
Yeah,
and that's why in some polls we put second choice.
Yeah,
and it looked like the second choice of a lot of those Barnes voters was the other brother,
David Crowley. All right, let's talk about black voters. So let's talk about black voters for a couple of reasons. One is because we have reached that point in the election cycle when people want to know what black people are doing, right? And it's always, from my experience, and I think this is your experience, that the questions around black people is always about why are they doing that, right? There's some reason to blame black people, right? Or to push a narrative about black folks that just simply isn't true. And some of that narrative comes from polling, right? We just had the Michigan race where there was this back and forth about, like, are black voters too centrist? Are they establishment? And they only vote for establishment people and they didn't vote for El Sayed. There's a lot of complication and nuance, I think, in how black people voted and or did not vote in Michigan. That's actually kind of irrelevant because they'll consolidate in the general. We had a piece in the New York Times the other day with Mara Gay, who's a part of the editorial team there in Georgia, talking to black voters in Georgia about how they're thinking about the election. I thought it was a really good piece, although I always feel a little unsettled when there is outlier opinions in a very small group of people, right? Because it gives so much more weight to that voice than it actually than that opinion actually exists broadly, right, in black communities. But we're talking about black voters, right? There is this: what are black people going to do? Where are they going to show up? Who are they going to vote for? Are they going to vote for progressives? Are they going to vote for DSA candidates? Which I won't make predictions either. But black people typically do what needs to be done. So that's what I'll say on that. But you have been looking at some numbers about how black folks have turned out or not turned out over the last few election cycles, and really kind of a troubling number that is, drop off and fall off, right, from participation in black communities. And particularly when we know in a moment where investment needs to happen and making sure, in this moment in particular, where people are really concerned about voting rights and the attack on voting rights, there's an opportunity to not have the kind of drop off that we saw in 22, but we're struggling to get folks, the Democratic Party itself and Democratic donors, to understand the opportunity, what the opportunity is to invest in black folks right now.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I say is that African American voters, like every other voting cohort in this country, will vote what they see in their best interest. Like, that's hard stop. They're going to vote in the direction or for candidates they see that they believe are behaving and pulling policies and are going to fight in their best interest. Right. What we've seen going back since 2008. Look, before 2008, you had a gap between African American and white voters, and Hispanic, and the gap between Hispanic and white voters has even been larger. But let's just talk about African American voters now. Mm-hmm. Anything from 10 to 12 point turnout difference, right? Meaning, you'll get white voters turning out at 56% and African American voters turning out at 46%.
Right.
In 2008, there's something happened in 2008. I forget what that happened in 2008.
Some man from Chicago or Hawaii.
Some man from Chicago with a lot of hope, who actually invested in our campaign, lots of time and resources going after younger voters and voters of color. And when I'm talking about younger voters, I'm talking disproportionately about voters of color because, as you know,
Right.
millennials and Gen Z are the most diverse generation of Americans ever, right?
Right.
And guess what happened when we put a lot of resources and time and effort, as well as you had a charismatic figure who could speak to that group and meet them where they were. You saw African American turnout and white turnout, that gap shrink. You actually had that gap vanish, where you had African Americans turning out at the same rate, and depending on the site that you look at for turnout numbers, African Americans actually turned out higher, a point or two higher than white voters, which was extraordinary because it never happens.
Right. Right.
Now, what
right.
you've seen since the end of 2012 is you've seen that gap open back up,
Right.
and not only has it. And part of the reason that gap has opened back up is not that African Americans have dramatically stopped voting or dropped off from 2012, right? You still have, again, depending on the numbers, the site you look at, you still have African Americans turning out at higher rates than they did before 2008. The problem is, well, it's not a problem. It's a problem we have to fix. The issue is in 2016 and 2024 and actually 2020, you saw a remarkable thing happen,
Right.
Adrian.
Yep.
And you saw white voter turnout spike and
Right.
jump up above
Right.
everyone else.
Right.
And a lot of that was being driven from rural communities and small town communities in a way we haven't seen before. And look, hats off to Republicans because they were doing what they're supposed to do. They went out and got their sporadic voters. They energized them and mobilized them. Now, what they were mobilizing them around, Adrian, we'll save for another show.
Right.
But
Yep.
so you saw that turnout. So you saw that gap increase by 10 or so points, and that's where we stand right now structurally. But Adrian, there's not a battleground state
Yeah.
that if African American turnout is within 3 or 4 points of white turnout, the outcome is dramatically different. Look, if African American turnout is within 4 points of white turnout in North Carolina, there is no doubt, Roy Cooper is going to be elected, right? If African American turnout is within 4 points of white turnout in Ohio, I like Sherrod Brown's chances of flipping that seat. If African American turnout if African Americans make up 31, 32, or 33% of the electorate in Georgia, Ossoff is going to win clearly, and Keisha Lance Bottoms is going to be the first African American black woman to be elected governor of Georgia. Actually, governor of any state.
Well, governor of any state, governor of a black woman in the history of the republic. Yeah.
Yes. But that's the power of the black vote, the potential there. Right. Now, the problem is structurally, like you do with any group, you have to make investments. It's not like they spent $1 billion chasing these mythical swing white voters in the last presidential election.
Yes, I was there. It was shocking.
Yes. And what you have a memo out, and I have a memo out, and I hope people have a chance to read it, and I hope we put it somewhere where they can read it. Is making the case that you have to make investments in organizing and mobilizing in the black and brown community if you want to see increased mobilization and turnout. That's not racial. That's just common sense.
That's just trying to win.
Yes. And the investment hasn't happened, and you're witness to the investment not happening. And this is why it's so problematic, because right now, the Supreme Court's gutting of the Voting Rights Act and the unprecedented perception that Donald Trump and the rise of white nationalism is an existential threat to the African American community presents a mobilization opportunity the likes of which we have not seen since 2008. The question is, will that be realized? And there's a lot of back and forth on social media right now about all blacks or African Americans are prepared to turn out at higher numbers. as if though it's just going to happen
Right.
without any resources or
Yeah.
organization there. They would put resources and organizations on in other communities to help boost turnout and mobilization. But for African Americans, it should just happen organically.
Yeah. Well, I think that this is what I mean. There is not a black organization in the country who is not shouting from the rooftops right now about the lack of resources that they have had as we are approaching Labor Day, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is the point that you're raising so clearly and so importantly and so urgently, which is what the memo that we have out is attempting to do, which is to say we're running out of time. And this is exactly even worse, I would say, than what we saw in 2024 when black organizations were also screaming from the rooftops, we're running out of time to reach people. We're running out of time to mobilize people. The difference here is this existential threat that you are talking about, that when we're doing focus groups around the country, people are saying to us, this is why I'm about to show up to the polls and vote, right? Even people that we talked to who were like, yeah, I sat out in 2024, right?
Yeah.
Like, I just didn't think it was going to matter, and so I didn't vote. Now are like, I need to make sure that I show up, and it's because they're coming for everything for us. They want to erase us, right? They want to erase us from history. They want to erase us from Congress. They want to erase us from elected office at every level. They want us out of public spaces. They don't want our kids in their universities. They don't want our kids in their K through 12 schools, right? And so people see this and they're like, no, there is like voting is not the only thing, but it is a way for us to demonstrate our power. And the fact that there is a whole ecosystem who has not understood that this is the moment, right?
Yeah.
This is the moment because this moment carries you into 28. Either it will or it won't, right? And
Definitely.
I always say, like, roll the dice. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah.
You don't want to invest in black voters and black voter mobilization in a moment like this, where there is a crisis that this particular constituency understands in their DNA. And you don't want to invest in maximizing their participation. You don't want to invest in political firms, right? Be they media, digital polling. You don't want to invest in those firms to make sure that you are having the right conversations and delivering the right messages to the different segments of the black electorate that need to turn out. You want to do that? Then let's see what happens, because we saw what happened in 2024 when you did the same thing.
Yeah, no, that perpetuates the structural problem of turnout and differences between white audiences, white voters, African American voters, and Hispanic voters. Right? It is. There's not a different value within the groups about participation. There's different resources that are going to mobilization and speaking to those groups and meeting them where they are, and this is such an opportunity. Again, an opportunity I haven't seen for mobilization since 2008.
Yeah.
And I hope we don't blow it because of what you just laid out.
Well, and I think that this also, I mean, there were other implications. I mean, again, we talked earlier about how, black voters will consolidate around the candidate who is going to do what needs to be done. And we know that will happen. But there's also been this like tension and question around, progressive voters and DSA and, all the kids say they're democratic socialists. You know what I'm saying? So there's also a growing kind of divide. I don't want to say divide because that makes it sound like it's maybe more than it is. But in terms of generations, right? You do have younger folks saying we want something else, we want something new, right? And we think that we need to be dreaming bigger, right? We need to be demanding more. We need to be, putting out policies that really do the thing that we all want, right? Not sort of watered down versions of it. And so there is a moment, I think, within the Democratic Party where the party itself has to recognize that there is this expectation from voters about what people want them to do, right? And that includes black folks, right?
Yeah.
I think this sort of relying on, this idea that came out of Michigan, but not just Michigan, that black folks are just going to vote for centrists. That's not a thing, right? And I think the party itself needs to be careful about assuming, what direction black voters and the black community, period, right, is willing to go in, especially when we see identification with the Democratic Party, dropping. People don't identify themselves as Democrats in the same way that Black folks have historically.
And that's where I want to double click on, right? Two points really quickly. One is why you need these organizations and mobilization efforts is because this isn't 2008 where such a vast majority of African Americans are IDing as Democrat and have warm feelings towards Democrats. And we've seen in some of your polling, we've tracked over the years how, quite frankly, the warmth of feelings towards Democrats, I've never seen it this low before, right? I've never seen, and that's true of African Americans, but it's also true of Hispanics, but also younger voters.
Yeah.
They are not as favorable to Democrats as they once were. That doesn't mean they're breaking Republican because they're absolutely ice cold to Republicans.
Right.
But they're not warm Democrats, and that's why you actually have to have program.
Yep.
To talk to them and reach them about what it is that these Democrats are going to be fighting for, and what are the stakes. So that's why this organizing is so important. Two is, it's funny because I don't put a lot of, the sort of ideal about DSA and the left and progressives, they're front page news all the time because they're driving a narrative about conflict. And for me, it's that guy. I have two posters on behind me. One is Jesse Jackson, one is Barack Obama.
Yeah.
You know what those two rode upwards? Young people looking for change.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm shocked that young voters are once again anti-establishment and looking for change.
Yep.
That has been driven almost every movement that we've had on the political left, anyway.
Yeah. Yep.
Almost every movement we've had, real movement on the political left, has been driven by young people who say, "This is not working. We need change."
Yeah.
And so I just see that as a part of that. As a part of this cycle, and by rightfully so, is that young people looking for change has pushed the Democratic Party and progressive politics when it needs to be pushed historically. And I think you see that happening again. I don't look at it as necessarily a bad thing that young people are looking for change. I understand it.
Yeah. Well, it's actually a good thing because change is what we need. We're in unprecedented times.
Yes.
And attempting to operate as if we are not in unprecedented times is why we keep finding ourselves, trying to dig out of a ditch or digging ourselves further into a ditch, actually. But yeah, so I want to just close here because I think that this is so critical that this conversation about will there be investment to mobilize voters of color, period, right? So I also want to be clear that there isn't a whole lot of investment going into mobilizing Latino and Asian voters either. But I think we understand that Black voters in many of the swing states are in fact the decisive factor. Right, in who wins and who loses, and we'll see, right? Like I always tell people that Black PAC receives 75% of its funding in 2024 on October 1st, right?
Which is insane.
And I cannot describe for people who don't do politics all day how outrageous it is, but imagine. Right, that three quarters of the money that you need to do a thing doesn't come until the last minute. Like, can you actually get the thing done? And so we'll see, right? We'll see if that begins to shift over the next few weeks for organizations across the country, groups that are on the ground in states, other national organizations like ours that are trying to communicate with voters. We'll see if there's a shift in that. Hopefully, our urgent memo drive some people to recognize that they need to get off the sidelines. So I want to thank you, Cornell, as always, for coming and talking about these things. We have 81 days until the election, so hopefully you'll grace us with your presence and your brilliance one more time. I tried to find your book in my bookshelf behind us so that I could be like, and here's Cornell's book, but I didn't have my glasses on, so I think I just missed it. But next time we'll have the book up.
Well, it's time for us to write. It's time for us to write a book, Adrian.
Yeah.
So folks should be looking for that to come out.
Yeah, we got things in the works, people. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining.
I always learn so much when I listen to you and Cornell talking. But the one thing that really stood out was when he said polling is not predicting the future. And we're looking at polling as being like, this is exactly what can happen. Anything can happen. Like he was breaking it down like there's relative certainty about certain things. But when you have those voters that are still out there that need to be consolidated, that need to be reached, that can make all the difference. So there was so much that I think folks really need to understand as we're moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, polls are a demonstration of what is happening, or like a version of what is happening in a given moment, right? It does not mean that it is the truth up until election day. It means that in that moment when the polling was happening, that's where voters were, and that's why people do polling throughout an election cycle, because things change, right? Events happen that move people, etc. And then I think the other thing that he said that's important is that there's just trash polling out there, right? There's polling out there that is attempting to drive a narrative that isn't really about understanding or helping the public understand where voters are. It is about, you've decided that you want to tell a story, and you go find the voters that are going to agree with that story, and then you say, here's my poll that says that the thing that I'm saying is accurate, right? It's a little bit like in 2024, the sort of nonsense narrative about how Black voters were, about to engage in a historic political realignment and all go to the Republican Party and vote for Donald Trump. That didn't happen, wasn't a thing then, what isn't a thing now, but there was polling that drove that narrative, and the media was happy to pick it up. So we need to be careful about what polls we look at, and we should identify, again, we always talk about trusted messengers. Who are the pollsters out there who you trust, and listen to what they say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why also, like I said, I appreciate Cornell, and folks can follow Cornell on social media because he's always breaking it down. But like, we have to understand the nuance, right? And like what is happening and how it's, because it might be good for clicks or the headlines, but what does it do? And what does it actually tell voters, for those of us who are looking for guidance? It also doesn't tell you anything about like the issues or what people are saying. Like you said, it's a snapshot in time. So how we're moving and how we're like with 81 days and there's so many big stake races, polling can be useful to tell us some things, but from a voter's perspective, we should also like think about the values that matter and vote accordingly.
That's right. And really, from a voter's perspective, what we should be doing right now is not paying attention to polls and talking to people about why they need to vote.
Absolutely.
We need to be turning
Absolutely.
Up, right? The other point of the conversation, we need to rely on ourselves to get our community out. We need to, also insist that people invest because our vote is valuable. But we also need to be doing the work that we need to do to check our registration, check everybody that we know, make them check their registration, and get prepared to vote and get a plan to vote. Okay, so the thing that you just said that's important is that we're 81 days away from election day.
81 days.
And folks should act accordingly. We will try and keep you up on the news, things that are related to the election, but also things that are not related to the election. There's a lot of stuff happening in the country right now that is important in terms of direction, right? The future of America. So we'll be trying to keep people up to date on that, bringing you to the news stories that feel like they're relevant for the moment and not necessarily like, we don't want to be like the bad polls and saying this is how things are going to be forever.
Absolutely.
Making sure that people have the information that you need. So we appreciate you for joining us once again here at the Village News Week in Review, and we will see you next week.
Absolutely. Like, share, subscribe. Bye, y'all.